The hum of New York City buzzed through the walls of the high-rise apartment, muffled but constant, like the static of an unsettled life. Nathan Caldwell stood at the wide glass window, suit jacket discarded on the back of a leather chair, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie slightly loosened. He looked every inch the CEO he had fought to become. Powerful, composed, in control. Except his 5-year-old daughter was in the next room trying to put a shoe on her ear. "Emmy," he called, rubbing a hand over his face, "that's not where it goes, sweetheart." She looked up from the carpet, a chaotic nest of stuffed animals and puzzle pieces surrounding her. "It's a phone today," she said, pressing the sneaker to her cheek. "Hello, this is Dr. Shu, you have worms." Nathan choked back a laugh, the kind that had started to come easier in the past year, since Julia. "Okay, Dr. Shu, time to get your backpack." "But Daddy," Emmy whined, flopping dramatically onto her belly, "my hair is stupid." He paused in the hallway, one hand on the strap of his leather briefcase. She was sitting up now, touching the wild mass of blonde curls that framed her small, heart-shaped face. The same curls her mother used to know how to tame. Nathan crouched beside her, suddenly very aware of how clumsy his fingers were. "Your hair is perfect," he said. "It's poofy. I like poofy. I want braids like Mia had at school. You can't do braids." The disappointment in her voice was a quiet stab, the kind he was getting used to taking with a nod and a slow breath. "You're right," he admitted, "I can't do braids." That morning, like too many others, ended with a rushed ponytail and a promise to try again later. Nathan's driver waited downstairs, and his schedule was a series of blocks colored red on his phone. Meetings, calls, crisis. But as the elevator descended and he caught sight of his reflection in the brushed metal walls, he saw it again. The thing he couldn't name yet, not guilt, not exactly, something quieter. Julia had arrived 5 months earlier, a friend of a friend, new in the city. Former art teacher turned part-time nanny while she figured things out. She wasn't on the agency's list. She had no references he could vet through his usual back channels, but she'd knelt on the carpet with Emmy during the interview, asked her about dinosaurs, and actually listened. Nathan had seen his daughter's shoulders lower for the first time in days. He hired her on the spot. In the beginning, they barely spoke. Julia arrived at 7, always with coffee and a soft smile. She never hovered, never filled the air with noise. She moved through the apartment with a kind of quiet certainty, unbothered by its cold lines and curated artwork. The first time Nathan came home to music playing, actual music, not Emmy's animated sing-alongs, it startled him. The apartment smelled like cinnamon. There were watercolor paintings drying on the windowsill. He'd frowned at the mess and the noise, at the way his daughter had giggled from the kitchen while frosting cookies. But Julia had looked at him from across the marble island, flour smudged on her cheek, and said, "We cleaned up what we could. The rest is worth the memory." And somehow it had been. By late February, Julia had become part of the rhythm of the household. She folded Emmy's socks the same way every time. She left gentle notes in Emmy's lunchbox. She never asked questions about Nathan's work or his long hours or the way he sometimes stood outside his daughter's room with a hollow look in his eyes. But she noticed things. One night he came home late after a grueling board meeting. He found a Tupperware container labeled "Emmy says this is Daddy's favorite." It was her mother's lasagna recipe. Julia had never met his late wife, never been told about the recipe box hidden in the pantry, but she'd asked. She'd listened. And he'd eaten every bite. Still, he hadn't really seen her. Not fully. Not until that Tuesday in March when a deal was crumbling and Emmy had a cold and he was standing by the elevator with one shoe on, ready to leave. And then he paused, he looked back. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't last long with a child unless something has captivated her. He walked to Emmy's bedroom door and leaned against the frame. Julia sat cross-legged on the carpet, Emmy between her knees. The little girl's hair was divided into neat, even sections, fingers working with gentle precision. Braids took shape like lines of poetry. Emmy was humming, completely still. And Julia was smiling, not at Nathan, not at anything but the simple act of braiding. She tucked a final strand, secured it with a flowered band, and kissed the top of Emmy's head without thinking. Emmy leaned back into her like a sunflower toward the sun. Nathan stood there longer than he should have. He didn't say anything, didn't know what he would say, but something in his chest shifted, something he didn't recognize right away. When Julia looked up and caught his eye, she didn't flinch. She just smiled, that small, knowing smile she always wore when she saw through him. And he smiled back, hesitantly, uncertainly. The elevator beeped behind him. He turned away. But the shape of the moment followed him all day. He found himself distracted in meetings, eyes drifting to the braid coiled at the crown of his daughter's head in the morning photo Julia had texted him. He stared at it on the screen long after the image faded. He hadn't expected something so simple to undo him. But it did. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, Nathan left his briefcase untouched by the door and lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary. The coffee was already brewed, Julia's doing always, and a small container of blueberries had been rinsed and set out next to Emmy's cereal bowl. He watched as Julia poured milk with her usual unhurried rhythm, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, wrists smudged faintly with graphite. She must have been sketching again. He never asked what she drew. He had meant to. It was the kind of question that felt too intimate, and yet he was learning that intimacy didn't always come from grand confessions. Sometimes it was watching the way she rubbed Emmy's back when she coughed, or how she always crouched down to Emmy's eye level when she explained things. Nathan crossed his arms and leaned against the marble counter, pretending to read the news off his phone. Julia glanced up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She's still a little sniffly, but she wanted to go, said Mia's bringing the sparkly stickers today. He nodded, thanks, I'd forgotten about that. You've got a lot on your plate. It wasn't a dig, just a simple fact. He should have left then. He was already 10 minutes behind, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching Emmy chew thoughtfully on a spoon, her tiny braids framing her face again like they belonged there. Did you braid her hair again? He asked. Julia smiled without looking up. She asked, and bribed me with a sticker. A pink unicorn glittered on the inside of her wrist. She held it out like a badge. Hard to resist that kind of offer. He chuckled under his breath. You're good with her. I like her, she said, simple and clear. She's easy to like. Nathan didn't say anything, but something loosened in his chest at her words. That old tension, the fear of Emmy being treated like a burden, of being an inconvenience to people who didn't understand her, seemed to quiet whenever Julia was around. By the end of the week, the photo roll on Nathan's phone had filled with pictures of braids. Emmy with 2 pigtail plaits, Emmy with a braided crown that looked like something from a storybook, Emmy with loose side braids and mismatched barrettes. He scrolled through them in cabs and boardrooms, during late dinners and silent elevator rides. They grounded him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He wasn't sure when he started looking for signs of Julia in the background of those pictures, a corner of her sketchbook, her slippered feet beside Emmy's, once her hand brushing back a curl. He noticed more, too, how Julia always waited until he came home before she left, even if it was late, how she never asked questions about his meetings or made comments about his absences, though she could have, how she always left the apartment feeling warmer than it had been before she arrived. One Thursday evening, Nathan returned early. Rain freckled the windows, city lights smearing like paint across the glass. Inside, Emmy was fast asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked under her chin. The television glowed softly with an old animated movie, muted. Julia sat beside her, a sketchpad balanced on her knees, feet tucked beneath her. She looked up when he entered, startled. Sorry, he whispered, didn't mean to interrupt. She shook her head and closed the sketchbook gently. You're home early. He nodded, felt like I should be. He crossed the room and crouched near the couch, brushing a hand over Emmy's curls. The braids were a little looser today. She fell asleep during the opening credits, Julia murmured. We had a busy day. What do you do? We built a fort, made sock puppets, learned about sea turtles. Nathan smiled at that, productive. The sock puppets were emotionally intense, lots of dramatic goodbyes. He laughed softly so he wouldn't wake his daughter. Then, without fully thinking, he glanced at the sketchpad on Julia's lap. "May I?" he asked. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge, then relaxed. "Sure." He opened the page and felt his breath still. It was a drawing of Emmy, not posed or formal. Just a quiet moment, her head tilted, fingers plucking petals from a daisy, her expression focused and serene. It captured something he didn't know could be captured, the softness, the thoughtfulness. "She was sitting on the windowsill last week," Julia said, "told me flowers are like people. Sometimes they open when the sun's out and sometimes they don't." Nathan swallowed, something thick behind his throat. "She says things like that all the time," he murmured. "I'm always too busy to write them down." Julia looked at him for a long moment. "You're not missing them, Nathan. You're just storing them differently." The way she said his name caught him off guard. It was the first time in weeks she'd used it. Not Sir. Not Mr. Caldwell, just Nathan. He looked at her and saw the truth of it, the shift. She wasn't just Emmy's nanny anymore. She was part of the picture. And something inside him knew he was already too far gone. The next day he found himself standing in the hair aisle of a drugstore, staring at colorful packs of elastics and tiny barrettes shaped like animals. The cashier gave him a look when he asked for help choosing a detangler that wouldn't sting. He brought them home like offerings. Emmy squealed in delight. Julia raised an eyebrow, amused. But the next morning, when Emmy asked for Daddy to do it, he froze. Julia stepped in gently. "We can do it together." And they did, Nathan holding the comb with uncertain hands, Julia guiding him, patient, Emmy grinning between them like she'd orchestrated the whole thing. Later that night, after Emmy had fallen asleep, he lingered again. Julia was slipping on her coat when he said it. "You matter here," he said. She stilled, her hand hovered near the doorknob. He added, "I don't think I've said that before. I should have." Julia turned slowly. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but the way she looked at him, steady, almost sad, made him wonder if he'd waited too long to see what was right in front of him. But it was there, finally, in the air between them. The shift. Not in words, but in silence. In the braid at the crown of Emmy's head. In the sketch of a girl with petals in her hand. Something had begun. And Nathan couldn't ignore it anymore. Julia stopped taking the subway home after dark. Nathan had started offering her a ride without asking. At first she'd hesitated, brushing it off with a polite, "I don't want to be a bother," but the way he said "you're not" made it hard to argue. So now most evenings they ended up in the back seat of his black car, Emmy asleep between them, her head nodding softly against her booster seat. The rides were quiet at first, comfortable mostly. Nathan would scroll through messages on his phone with less urgency than he used to, and Julia would stare out the window, watching the blur of city lights fade into quieter streets. Sometimes they talked. Short sentences, low voices, little confessions that slipped through the seams of the day. "She wants to be an astronaut this week," Julia said one night, Emmy's tiny sneaker resting against her thigh. Nathan glanced sideways. Last week it was a veterinarian. She gave her stuffed giraffe a full checkup this morning, diagnosed him with emotional broken bones. Nathan smiled. "That tracks." Julia tilted her head. "You used to want to be a pilot, didn't you?" He looked up from his phone, surprised. "How'd you know that?" "She told me," Julia said simply. "Said you used to fly paper planes with her on the balcony. You name them after cities." He hadn't realized she remembered. Those evenings became a ritual. Nathan would close his laptop earlier. Julia would linger a little longer after Emmy's bedtime stories, her coat draped over the arm of the couch instead of already buttoned up. They started sharing more, not big things, just details, fragments, but they added up. Nathan told her about his father, who'd run a printing shop in Queens and never really understood what his son did for a living. Julia told him about the way she used to paint rooftops in the early mornings back home, standing on fire escapes in bare feet. Nathan told her he hadn't touched a paintbrush since college. Julia asked him why, but he didn't answer right away. One night, after a long silence in the car, he finally said, "Because I forgot how to look at the world that way." Julia didn't speak, she just reached across the seat and handed him Emmy's sketchpad. "Borrow hers for a while," she said. "She's better at it anyway." Nathan kept the sketchpad in his office the next day. He didn't touch it, just glanced at it every now and then between calls. It sat there like a reminder, like a question he hadn't figured out how to answer. That weekend, a last-minute meeting pulled Nathan out of the apartment on a Saturday morning. He was already halfway into a tie when he passed the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of himself. Emmy was behind him, barefoot in her pajamas, dragging a blanket across the hardwood floor. "Daddy," she said, "you forgot." He turned, brow furrowing. "Forgot what?" She pointed to her head. "Hair." Julia wasn't scheduled to come that morning. Nathan had told her to take the weekend off. She hadn't argued, she rarely did. He crouched and tried to remember what Julia had shown him. He parted Emmy's hair gently, awkwardly. She winced once when the comb snagged but didn't say anything. He felt clumsy and slow, but when he finally fastened the tiny elastic at the bottom of the braid, she gave him a proud grin. "You did it," she said. "It's a little crooked." "It's a daddy braid," she whispered, touching it like it was precious. "I love it." Later, when Julia arrived on Monday morning, Emmy ran to her with the breathless excitement of someone who'd just returned from a far-off land. She pointed to the lopsided braid still clinging to the side of her head. "Daddy did this one. You can fix it, but not all the way." Julia knelt, examining it with a seriousness that made Nathan want to look away. "It's perfect," she said. "Looks like it was made with love." Nathan turned to pour his coffee, not because he needed it, but because he didn't trust his expression. That week, Julia brought a box of ribbon clips shaped like stars and moons. Emmy insisted they start a collection. Nathan watched as Julia braided with slow, steady hands, each twist practiced, gentle. She was telling Emmy a story about the moon having hair, how the stars helped braid it every night so it wouldn't get tangled in the wind. Emmy was rapt. Nathan couldn't stop looking at Julia's hands. He thought of how those same fingers had helped Emmy tie her shoes, had wiped spaghetti sauce from her cheek, had adjusted the straps on her backpack, had lingered for a moment too long when she passed him the coffee cup he forgot on the counter. It started to become too much. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking. Her laugh, easy and unself-conscious, especially when Emmy told one of her nonsense knock-knock jokes. The way she chewed on her thumb when she read. The way she left the hall light on for Emmy every night, even though the little girl hadn't needed it in months. He started staying home on purpose, canceling calls, pushing meetings, just to be around her longer, and still he said nothing. Then came the field trip. Emmy's preschool was visiting a botanical garden and they needed chaperones. Nathan signed up before thinking it through. When he told Julia, she blinked. "You're coming." "I cleared the morning." "You cleared your schedule for a class of 5-year-olds armed with juice boxes and too much energy." He shrugged. "I figured I should learn what a carnivorous plant looks like before Emmy tries to grow one in the bathtub." The morning was chaos. Rain had mudded the paths, kids were slipping everywhere, and one child tried to eat a tulip, but Nathan couldn't stop smiling. Emmy clung to his hand most of the time, beaming like the sun followed her. Julia walked beside them, her umbrella too small for both of them, so she kept shifting it to shield Emmy's curls. At one point, they stopped in a glass house full of orchids. Nathan stood beside Julia while the kids scattered. "She keeps talking about this place," he said quietly. "She told me once that flowers are brave," Julia said, "because they bloom even when no one's watching." He looked at her, really looked, her lashes damp from the mist, the curve of her cheek, the way her gaze stayed steady on the glass above them, but her body leaned ever so slightly toward his. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask if she felt it too, that weightless, fragile tension between them. But Emmy came bounding back, announcing she had discovered a flower that looked like a happy banana, and the moment folded inward. Later that night, as he walked Julia to the door, the apartment dim and quiet, Emmy already asleep, he stopped her. "I don't know what this is," he said, the words low and rough, "but I think about you when you're not here." Julia looked up slowly. "I think about you too." Neither of them moved. Nathan didn't touch her, didn't lean in, but the air between them pulsed with something unsaid. When she stepped outside, he stayed at the door for a long time. Something had shifted again. But this time it wasn't just within him. It was between them. And it was no longer quiet. Spring came in fragments. Not all at once, but in the slow unraveling of chill from the morning air, in the yellow buds lining the sidewalks, and in the way the sunlight stretched just a little farther into the evening windows. Nathan noticed it because Julia did. She pointed out the subtle changes to Emmy during their walks home from preschool, how the trees looked like they were yawning, how the ground felt softer, how birds sang longer. Nathan found himself listening too, to the city in a way he hadn't in years, as if all the corners he used to pass without seeing now held quiet, unfolding stories. Julia never said anything more about what had passed between them, and neither did he. But it lived in the way they spoke to each other now, in the way their eyes lingered, in the moments of pause that stretched a few seconds too long. The week after the field trip, Nathan came home to the smell of something baking. He dropped his briefcase by the door and followed the sound of laughter to the kitchen. Emmy stood on a stool beside Julia, hands covered in flour, cheeks smudged with chocolate. "Surprise," Julia said, brushing hair from her face. "She wanted to make something for you." Emmy held up a lumpy tray of cookies with proud defiance. "They look weird, but they taste like dreams." Nathan bit into one and made a show of collapsing dramatically. "I've never tasted a better weird dream in my life." Julia smiled, the kind of smile that curled at the edges and didn't try to hide. Later, after Emmy had been bathed and tucked in, Nathan found Julia rinsing dishes at the sink. He leaned against the counter beside her, arms crossed, watching her move. "You know you've changed everything, right?" he asked. She didn't turn around. "Everything." "This place, me, her," he hesitated. "I didn't think anyone could." Julia shut off the tap. Water dripped quietly into the basin. "I didn't think I could either," she said. There was something in her voice then, not uncertainty, not fear, but the worn quiet of someone who knew what it was to build a life around other people's needs and forget how to be seen. Nathan stepped closer. "You do that thing where you give everything to everyone else. Where do you go when you need something?" Julia finally turned. "I haven't figured that part out yet." Their eyes met and Nathan's breath caught in his throat, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was real, present, and because somewhere between coloring pages and whispered lullabies, she had become the only thing in his life that didn't feel transactional. "I see you," he said. Julia didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night he didn't offer her a ride. She didn't ask. She just stood by the door, hand on the knob, looking back once. A look that asked a question neither of them knew how to voice. The answer hovered between them. By Friday, Emmy was talking about Julia nonstop, how she made up songs while brushing her teeth, how she knew how to make paper cranes that could stand on one leg, how she always knew when to stop reading a bedtime story and let the silence take over. Nathan listened to it all, every story a little mirror reflecting a life he hadn't realized was forming around them. That weekend, Julia invited them both to an open studio exhibit in Brooklyn where she was showing a piece. She hadn't intended for Nathan to come. He could tell by the way she'd mentioned it casually, halfway through helping Emmy make a diorama for science class. But he said yes, not out of obligation, not even out of curiosity. He said yes because the thought of not seeing this piece of her, this part she kept quiet, suddenly felt unbearable. The studio was tucked behind a bookstore, all exposed beams and unfinished wood floors. Paintings lined the walls, some abstract, some raw and loud with color, some quiet and still. Emmy tugged Nathan's hand toward a corner with free lemonade and paper crowns. He spotted Julia across the room, standing near a canvas that stretched almost floor to ceiling. She looked different here, more grounded somehow, like this place remembered who she was before New York and before them. He walked to her slowly, stopping in front of the painting without asking if it was hers. He knew. It was Emmy, not literally, not in detail, but in shape, in movement. The The strokes of color formed the curve of a child reaching, as if chasing something just beyond the frame. The light followed her, not shining on her but drawn toward her, as though she was the center of it. Nathan stared at it, feeling something loosen deep in his chest. "I started it the day I met her," Julia said beside him. "Finished it last week." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me you painted her?" She smiled faintly. "Because I didn't know if I should. This wasn't about you." The words weren't sharp, they were honest, and they landed in him like a weight. Nathan didn't reply right away. He turned back to the canvas and whispered, "It is now." That evening back at the apartment, Emmy was asleep early. The city buzzed below them, but everything in the apartment felt slow and warm. Julia stood by the window, arms folded, the reflection of lights painting across her face. Nathan approached her, his voice low. "Stay." She turned toward him. "Tonight." He nodded. "Not because I need you to watch her, not because she asked for braids, because I want you here." Julia was very still. Then quietly, "I've wanted to hear that for a long time." Nathan reached for her hand, just gently, just enough. "Then hear it again. Stay." She didn't answer in words. She stepped toward him, rested her forehead lightly against his chest, and let herself exhale. They stood like that for a long time. Not as CEO and nanny. Not as man and woman still trying to figure out how to bridge the space between fear and want. But simply as two people who had been learning, slowly, quietly, how to hold a life together, one braid at a time. The morning after she stayed, the apartment felt different. Not louder, not messier, just lived in. The scent of coffee came not from a pre-programmed machine but from the slow boil of water in the kettle and the way Julia hummed under her breath while pulling mugs from the cupboard. Nathan stood in the hallway for a moment, unnoticed, taking in the way the light poured across the hardwood. Emmy was still asleep, limbs sprawled across her small bed, hair unbraided for once, wild in a way that reminded him of the little girl she used to be before everything changed. Julia moved like she belonged here. Not as a guest, not as a caretaker, just herself. A woman who made space feel warmer by being in it, a presence he had grown used to needing in ways he hadn't dared name. She turned and caught him watching. "Morning," she said, quiet but sure. "Morning." He walked toward her, took the mug she handed him, their fingers brushing. For a moment they just stood there, the city waking slowly around them, the soft thrum of the kettle filling the silence. "I didn't think I'd ever have this again," he said. "Not really." Julia sipped her tea, her gaze resting on the window. "Not everything comes back the same way." "No," he said, "but it doesn't feel like starting over." She looked at him. "What does it feel like?" "Like we've been writing this into the quiet. For months, we just didn't know how to read it yet." She didn't answer, but he didn't need her to. Later that week, he told his assistant to hold his calls. He spent the morning at home, sitting beside Julia while Emmy played beneath a blanket fort they'd built together. There were books scattered across the carpet, dolls dressed in CEO suits made from cut-up dish towels, and a small sign above the blanket entrance that read, "No bosses allowed unless they say please." Nathan crawled inside anyway, muttering please dramatically while Emmy giggled and Julia watched him from the couch. A pillow in her lap, smiling like this was the version of him that mattered most. In the evening they all cooked together. Julia let Emmy crack the eggs despite the risk. Nathan burned the garlic. They ate on the living room floor, the television off, soft music playing in the background. Julia sat with her back to the arm of the couch, bare feet tucked beneath her, eyes closed for a moment like she was memorizing something. He watched her from across the room, Emmy curled against her side, and he knew. It wasn't the braid, not really. It was what the braid meant, the carefulness, the presence, the willingness to slow down for someone else's needs. It was love. And not the kind Nathan had known before, not the sweeping declarations or performative promises. This was smaller, quieter. It was in the way Julia put Emmy's lunchbox in the fridge the night before, in the way she tilted her head when Nathan spoke, even if he hadn't finished his thought, in the way she stayed not because she had to, but because she chose to. He was still working late most nights, still wearing suits that looked like armor, still walking into rooms where people measured his worth by how many decisions he could make in under a minute. But he came home different now. More often he came home early. Sometimes he arrived in time to help with dinner, to chase Emmy down the hallway while she shrieked with delight, to learn how to part her hair straight enough that Julia didn't have to redo it. And sometimes he came home in time to sit with Julia in the quiet after Emmy fell asleep. No words needed, just the comfort of her leaning into him, her breath steady against his shoulder. It was on one of those nights that Julia asked, "Do you think you'll ever stop needing to be in control?" He thought about it. "I'm not sure I want to be anymore, at least not here." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know she loves you more in the mess than she ever could in the polished parts." He nodded. "I think I'm starting to love myself more in the mess too." Julia reached out and took his hand. "Then you're on the right path." The first time he kissed her, it wasn't dramatic. No rainstorm, no sudden orchestral swell. Just an ordinary Tuesday late evening, with dishes still drying in the sink and a faint crayon smell clinging to the air. Emmy was asleep, the apartment was quiet. Julia turned to say something, he never remembered what, and he kissed her before she could finish. "Soft certain." She kissed him back like it was something she'd been waiting to do for a long, long time. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "You really don't know how to braid, do you?" He laughed against her cheek. "I'm working on it." And he was. A month later, Emmy announced during breakfast that she wanted to grow her hair to the floor like Rapunzel. Julia smiled but gave Nathan a look. He took the hint. That evening he sat beside Julia, a comb in one hand, a small elastic looped awkwardly around his wrist. She showed him again, section by section, slow and patient. His fingers stumbled, then found rhythm. When he finished, Emmy squealed and threw her arms around his neck. "You did it," she shouted. "You made a butterfly braid." He looked at Julia. She was watching him, not with pride exactly, but with something deeper. It wasn't about the braid. It never had been. It was about learning to be gentle, about choosing to show up again and again, about creating something with your hands when your heart didn't quite know how to speak yet. It was love, slow and steady, tangled at times but intentional. Nathan had built billion-dollar companies, closed impossible deals. But braiding his daughter's hair, with Julia's hands guiding his, her presence grounding him, was the first thing that ever made him feel like he'd truly made something that mattered. And in that quiet, ordinary, extraordinary life they were shaping together, he found himself not just in love, but home,